But you know, like to see that in real life is pretty interesting. Yeah. Let me know. We're good? How's it sound? Okay, great. So since we're not going to do like a formal like introduction, which is good because I hate hearing my own bio, and I decided I wasn't going to like turn this presentation into my bio. I will give a little bit of background because I think it's the right thing to do, and since this is being recorded for posterity, maybe it would be helpful to put this into context. My name is Dexter Wimberly. I'm an independent curator. That's how I identify myself. I do other things, but I think that if I think about my life over the course of the past 10 to 12 years, being an independent curator really has defined who I am. Prior to that, when I was a wee 20-something, 21 years old, I started an advertising and PR agency, and that's what I did for 13 years. So my background is in communications. I went to Brooklyn College. I studied political science and sociology. My thought was that I was going to take a degree from there and then go on to law school and become an attorney because everyone told me, you'd make a great attorney. And when you're a kid, you're like, yeah, sure, sounds good, But then I realized that I was interested in other things. And so getting involved in the advertising and PR world was really inspired by my interest in music, fashion, entertainment, a lot of the things that many of us, at some point in our life, have either like dabbled in. We thought that would be our career or something we were passionate about, but I sort of decided that I wanted to, double down on that interest. And so my agency, and the reason I bring this up is because it kind of plays into where I'm at now. So my agency really was my entire life for about 13 years. So from like 21 years old to about, 34 or so. And so I was focused on helping brands connect with young customers, youth culture. So the whole thing in the 90s was, companies like Coca-Cola and Time Warner and Virgin Mobile and all of these companies wanted to like connect with like Generation X or Y. I don't even know what those generations are anymore. I don't even pretend to know. I don't pretend to know what's on the radio anymore. I don't pretend to know who's hot, what's cool, none of that stuff anymore. But anyway, I did know it then. And so I built this company along with a business partner, and we had some great international clients, and we met a lot of creative people who were, unbeknownst to me, moonlighting. And what do I mean by that? So, I was hiring graphic designers and photographers and other people to do these projects for my clients, not realizing that the guy that I had hired to, say, do a logo for Adidas actually had an MFA from Yale or RISD in painting or sculpture. I'm like, what is that? You're like, it was not my world, right? Or someone you would hire to, work with you on a fashion shoot had, a background of like performance art or some other aspect of their passion in life that they were somehow not able to activate for whatever their reasons are. Everyone has their own story, all of us. But they weren't able to activate it. And that became sort of like this little thing in the back of my mind. I was thinking like, so there's obviously, there's more to this world of creativity than I realized because my background wasn't in that space. I was coming from it more from a communications standpoint than from like a purely creative, like painterly, sculptor, performative standpoint. And so about year 10 in running my company, I decided that I wanted to do something else with my life, and I didn't know what that was. But as I started to talk to more and more of the artists who were moonlighting in my life about what their passions were and what their challenges were, I realized that what I was doing and what I knew as an entrepreneur could be applicable to helping artists kind of focus themselves around the other side of being an artist, not just what you do when you're in your studio. I guess to some degree that would be true also in your studio, but not just what you do in your studio, but what you do to amplify your career outside of your studio. Everything from, sales and marketing and representation and all of those things. I had no inclination early on in this journey to become a curator. I had no inclination to be an art dealer or any of those kinds of things. I just wanted to apply my passion to the lives of the artists that I was close to and that I considered to be my friends. And so to fast forward a bit, I started organizing small exhibitions just as a means of helping them get exposure, right? And all the while I'm still running my company and still thinking about, my exit strategy into another world, and that world would be the art world. An interesting thing happened 12 years ago. The Savannah College of Art and Design, SCAD, invited me down to give a talk. And I reluctantly said yes. My reason for being reluctant was that they wanted me to come down and talk about starting a, they wanted me to give a talk about starting a business in like the fashion and marketing world. And that was a world I wanted to get out of. And I'm like, now I got to go down and like fake the funk and give this talk about like that world in a very impassioned way to students when I really was just kind of like over it. But I said, you know what? Free trip. Never say no to a free trip. And I said, and also it's an opportunity to meet people that are part of a world that I'm interested in because they were in the art and design world. So I went down, I gave my talk, and I had dinner with some deans and different people from the school that evening. And a couple of weeks later, I get this email and said, you know, what you said was very interesting that evening. We're very interested in learning more about that, and we're doing some things around repositioning the college, and we wanted to know if you'd be interested in helping us with that endeavor. And I said, well, what does that mean? Well, would you be interested in being part of the communications and marketing team for the Savannah College of Art and Design? I said, okay, that sounds interesting. And so we worked out the details, and I became a consultant for SCAD, and I was going down to Atlanta and Savannah on a pretty regular basis for what I thought was going to be a couple of months, turned out to be almost a couple of years, right? And it was during that time, from 2006 to 2008, that I really got indoctrinated into this sort of like world of both academia in the context of art, but then also the challenges that young artists were facing leaving academia and kind of getting into what we consider to be the quote-unquote real world. I hate using that term because I don't even know what the real world is anymore. I thought I did, and then like election happened, and then I'm like, well, maybe I don't know. I thought I knew, but I don't know. But anyway, coming into the real world, and then also I was meeting a lot of very seasoned, older professors and who were also artists themselves and had their own careers and their own stories. And this was like super fascinating to me. So I said, you know what? I'm gonna take the foot that's still like lingering in the ad world, and I'm gonna remove that foot, and I'm gonna put both of my feet firmly into the world of visual art and into the world of working with artists. And I had no clear roadmap. I can tell you, quite frankly, that almost 10 years ago to this like time frame, 10 years ago to this season, I remember walking around in Chelsea and thinking to myself, like, what is going on here? Like, I know I've been here a lot and I've gone to shows, but like I had like a real like internal moment of sort of like epiphany, and I said, you know, I have no idea what it takes for an artist to go from complete obscurity to being represented by what we would consider to be a blue chip gallery. And I said, I'm going to figure that out. I'm going to figure this challenge out, not because that should be every artist's goal by any means, but I wanted to understand what that journey was like. And then also, from the standpoint of making a new path for my life, I wanted to understand how is it possible for someone to become an independent curator that can actually make a living. You know, I had no idea how crazy that mission was, right? And this is before I met my wife. I've been married for 6 years, and it's before I met my wife and before she and I had 3 young children. And as I mentioned, I have a 15-year-old, so it's like, what was I getting myself into? I had no idea. Would I do it all over again? Probably, but probably with a different perspective, right? A higher tolerance for pain and suffering, because there was a lot of that. And so my first opportunity to do any sort of art exhibition of what I would consider to be of note happened in 2009. I have been interested in history and economy and power dynamics my entire life, as far back as I can remember, like thinking about like how we live as people, how the government impacts how we live, how our finances impact how we live. I was a very nerdy kid. When I was 10 years old, my mother would take me to her friend's house, as most parents do. And you go back when I was 10, that's 35 years ago, no internet, no cable, no Game Boy. It was just like, you figure out what you're gonna do for the next 4 hours while we are in here talking adult stuff. And so what did I have access to? I had access to the 1983 World Book Encyclopedia. That's it. So every time my mom would take me to her friend's house, I would just make my way through each volume of the World Book Encyclopedia in 1983. And it became my friend. And so every single page, I will not lie and say I read every single page, of course not. But I looked at every single page and I read everything that was interesting to me. And that really shaped my mind from 10 years old, I would say even to this day. And so when I started thinking about working within the framework of contemporary art, I realized that because I did not have a traditional art history background, I was not going to approach this in the same way that someone with that kind of background might approach it, right? And certainly my approach might be similar to people who have that background, but I knew I couldn't go about it the exact same way. I had to think about what I wanted to focus on, what was interesting to me, right? So I've always been keenly interested in how our lives have been shaped and how we interact with one another. And so in 2009, I was approached by a very small, very small museum in Brooklyn called MOCADA, the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Arts. I happen to know Laurie Cumbo, who had founded that museum for years before that. And she was interested in exploring how gentrification was changing Brooklyn. And that was, this is a decade ago. So it was really just about to the hammer was coming down, but it was like really, you could kind of see all of the signs of how the borough was about to really be transformed because of like economic and demographic changes. And she approached me and she said, I know you're sort of building this career for yourself in the art world, and I know this is something that's interesting to you. Would you be interested in curating an exhibition about gentrification? And I said, that sounds incredibly boring, and sure, I'd love to do it, right? But little did I know that it would actually be one of the most exciting things I've ever done in my life. Because once I started reaching out to artists in the borough of Brooklyn whose lives were being transformed because of gentrification, I realized that there were like hundreds and hundreds of stories, if not thousands, but I heard hundreds of stories from different people who wanted to tell their story in the context of this show through their work. And so that exhibition happened. I'm not going to show you any images from it because I don't have them on the slideshow, but I just wanted to kind of give you some background. That exhibition happened in 2009. It involved 21 artists. It got a tremendous amount of visibility both in the press and people who attended the show, and it really transformed the way that I understood how I could interact with artists. It changed my sort of understanding of how I could actually empower artists to tell their stories. Like they already had all the means, but maybe I could be a vessel through which these stories could be amplified out to the broader public. And so all the while that's going on, I had this like burgeoning love affair with painting. I've never painted, except for one time I did this watercolor in junior high school because I wanted to win a trip to go to Japan. I did not win the trip. I do not have the painting. I can tell you it was middling at best. But I've never been an artist. I've never been a visual artist in that way. But I've had this love affair with painting for a really, really long time. And so I wanted to start working with artists that were not necessarily just like politically bent or like dealing with all these societal issues. And so I just started expanding what I was doing and looking for opportunities any and everywhere. As I mentioned earlier, I'm big on quality over quantity because I've done some things that were really high quality with really low quantity budgets and really low quantity, everything else you can kind of think of, but the quality level, I've always sought to do things at a really high level. And I'm gonna get to some of the things I wanna show you. I have some images from 3 exhibitions that I've organized in the past couple of years. So in the past 10 years, I have not only been an independent curator, but I worked at the Museum for African Art as the Director of Communications in 2011 to 2012. I was the Director of Strategic Planning at Independent Curators International from 2014 to 2016. I was a Executive Director of Aljira Center for Contemporary Art for about a year and a half until the earlier part of this year. So all the while I'm developing my independent curatorial practice, I've also worked at different nonprofits in different capacities. For a number of reasons. I mean, you know, there's like reasons of like building my career and helping those organizations. There's also fiscal reasons, like we all have to make a living, you know, and being an independent curator is a very, very challenging living, let me tell you that. But I've managed to, in the past 10 years, work on, between my independent projects and the organizations I've worked with, about 50 exhibitions, which is a lot, you know. I'm very proud of that, because I never thought that that would actually happen. So I want to just kind of quickly take you through 3 shows that I picked these shows, to be totally frank, because I love the images, and also, you know, you can't show everything. So in 2014, I conceptualized an exhibition called The Ease of Fiction. I've always been curious about how, you know, there's a difference between what has actually happened in history and what we believe to have happened, and I'm sure that's not a unique thought. We all know that the things we read is someone's description of an event as opposed to the actual event. And I wanted to explore that concept, not through the lens of sort of my life as an American or an African American, but really think about it in the context of a continent and a few countries that I had very little firsthand experience with. So I looked at that as an opportunity to engage with a couple of, I hate using these labels, but they are what they are, contemporary African artists whose work I've been following for some years. So there's an artist named Ruby Amanze, who was born in Lagos, Nigeria, who was raised in the UK and found herself living between New York and Philadelphia. Also in this show is an artist named Maleko Mogosti, who is born in Botswana. He's represented by Anna Fraser and also Jack Shaman Gallery. I met Maleko through just mutual friends. I met him actually when he was an artist in residence at Studio Museum in Harlem. And also there's an artist named Dihuri Reshemeza, whose work you'll see on the far wall there. She was born in Rwanda and traveled around the world growing up, lived in places like Germany. And also there's an artist in this exhibition who's actually based here in LA. Her name is, that's another work by Maleko Mogosti. Her name is Shireen Gerges. I don't know if you guys know Shireen. She was born in Luxor, Egypt, but she lives out here in LA. And so I don't have time to get into the underpinnings of all of their work, but I do just want to say that, you know, this exhibition originally was on view in the Contemporary Art Museum in Raleigh, North Carolina was the first museum to show this exhibition. And then it traveled to the California African American Museum. And then it traveled to San Francisco to the Museum of the African Diaspora. What's interesting about this project, as much as the work in the exhibition is very, very compelling, and each of these artists is sort of like dealing with like memory and history and the narrative that they grew up with and how later in life what they've learned has kind of challenged that narrative. The show actually had to change drastically at each museum that it's gone to. So now I'm going to give you some like inside baseball thing here, which is sort of like interesting. I had no idea that a traveling exhibition could be transformed each time the exhibition goes to a new venue, but like not just because like 1 or 2 pieces don't fit, but really we had to like reconstitute the entire exhibition each time it traveled, which for me was sort of an amazing opportunity to think about this idea of reality and fiction, right? Because if you saw the show in North Carolina, then you didn't see the show as it was in LA. And if you saw it in LA, you didn't see the show as it was in San Francisco. So it had this sort of like life of its own, and it was a really interesting way for me to think about what it means to move an exhibition around the country. I like to tell myself that, because otherwise it was just like I curated the show 3 times. The same show 3 times, which is not really the best way to really articulate that. I want to go to the next project. So this journey that I've been on has also afforded me the opportunity to work with galleries internationally. I met some fine folks from the Third Line Gallery in Dubai on the heels of another project that I'd worked on in 2013. And was given the opportunity to organize a group exhibition in their gallery in the Emirates. And what was interesting is that this show, A Fast Moving Sky, actually included 4 artists, none of which are Middle Eastern artists. There's Leonardo Benzant, whose work is sort of like the kite-like work you see on the wall there. Leonardo is from the Dominican Republic. Andrew Light, whose works are the sort of like painterly sculptural works on the wall there. Andrew is from Guyana. He's contemporaries with Frank Bowling, sort of both around the same age, both from Guyana. They know each other, sort of influence one another as well. Smaller works that you can't really see in detail here by an artist named Valerie Pereno, who is from Uganda, who grew up in the United States and also in the UK as well, and an American artist named Rashawn Baker, who I met at Yale when he was getting his MFA, but then he lives in the Maryland, DC area. And I was interested in figuring out how I could bring artists who have no direct connection to the Middle East or to the Emirates into that context. I knew that it would be done through, to some degree, a language of abstraction and sculpture, but also I wanted to see how not only the gallery and their collectors, but how the community there would respond and react to work that wasn't necessarily in the same vocabulary that they were used to. And it was very well received. I think that we could say that in the history of this gallery, the Third Line, this show was the first time they'd ever done a group show of artists that they did not represent. It opened up some really great conversations about the diaspora, like the African diaspora. Another terminology I find quite interesting to parse out, and we'll do that at another time, not right now. But it brought some very interesting conversations around that. But then also this idea of sort of trade between different places. Because it's a commercial gallery and all of the work was for sale, and I didn't really approach this from the standpoint of thinking about it just purely from the standpoint of what's the best work to sell, but really what's the best story to tell and how to engage with people. I found that a lot of people that live in Dubai are really from other places, like in terms of the part of the art network there. They're not like born and raised per se, they're like coming from Europe or coming from other parts of the world. So it's interesting to have that kind of like epiphany for people to say, yes, maybe we should explore showing more work from non-Middle Eastern artists in the context of what's happening here. And then this year, I had the honor of organizing Derek Adams' first solo museum exhibition in New York City at the Museum of Arts and Design. I've known Derek for, I'd say about maybe 5-6 years. I've known him pretty well, known of him longer than that. And his work, his practice has always been very intriguing to me because as far as artists go, I think he has figured out a way to, transform himself pretty regularly in terms of the types of work that he makes. He's very hard to pin down in terms of categorically. I mean, yes, he's a painter, he's a sculptor, he's a performance artist, he also does photography. It helps that he's also a really great guy, and so people tend to really want to get behind him and see him flourish. So he's had a lot of opportunities. He's done quite a bit of stuff out here as well. And I mean, if you know Derek Adams' work, you follow him on Instagram or any other like social platform, you see it's hard to understand how he's doing all of this. But anyway, he and I were having a conversation, a couple of years before the show happened about working together, and he had some interests that were very similar to mine. I mean, we're both African-American men who, grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and a lot of our influences are very similar. He grew up in Baltimore, I grew up in Brooklyn, and we kind of met at an interesting time in our careers, and we're thinking about how we could address our interest in history in a way that could be, more sort of exploratory than the typical exhibitions that we've been seeing done by some of our contemporaries, both curators and artists at the time. And he was working on a project that the Studio Museum of Harlem had commissioned him to organize around a black fashion designer named Patrick Kelly, who I wasn't very familiar with until talking to Derek. And Patrick Kelly was really apparently big in the 80s and early 90s before passing away, unfortunately, very early in life, and did a lot of runway shows and was sort of part of the whole like Paris and New York fashion scene, but flew under the radar. And so Derek was mining Patrick Kelly's archive at the Schomburg Library in Harlem. And while he was doing that, he came across some information about this little-known publication called the Green Book, which is a guide, a travel guide for African Americans.
They reprinted it.
Yeah, exactly. So he came across some information about this Green Book, which very, very succinctly, between 1936 and around 64, 65, a gentleman named Victor Hugo Green, who's an African-American mailman from Harlem, created a publication that was a guidebook that would help African-American motorists move about the country and find safe places to sleep and eat and have recreation during the time of Reconstruction and Jim Crow in the South. You know, and there were no other like options. Obviously, this is pre-internet, of course. So there really was, if you had a car, if you had the means to have a car and you wanted to travel from, say, Chicago to Alabama, well, God be with you, as they say, if it's 1940. And so you needed some guidance. And so Victor Hugo Green was very enterprising, and with no publishing background and no outside investors, at least in the beginning, he, along with, I'm sure, the help of his wife, conceived this publication. And for 30 years, they produced this publication annually, and it went on from being sort of like more of a leaflet to being a full-on like magazine with ads. He created a travel agency that was based in Harlem. It was not only helping African Americans navigate the country, and this is not a publication that was just about like once you get below the Mason-Dixon line, it gets a little bit scary. You know, there were listings from all 50 states, you know. There were things called sundown towns in all 50, you know, all over the country. I wouldn't say all 50 states, but all over the country, you would find these places that had these ordinances. If you're African American, don't be outside when the sun comes down, or your life is in your own hands, right? Like, you know, and I'm putting it politely, of course, right? It's not like the sign said that. That's almost like if you're on an airline, if you're African American, please do not be outside after, you know, it was much more harsh than that. But the idea was that all of the things that we take for granted, all of the freedoms that we take for granted, all the movement that we take for granted was something that you could not be guaranteed in the 30s and 40s and 50s traveling around by car in this country, particularly if you're an African American, and probably made worse so if you're an African American woman or, you know, or what have you. So we were very inspired by that, Derek and I. We saw this as both a social justice story, but also an entrepreneurial story. And we wanted to explore that. And so my pitch to the Museum of Arts and Design was that while Derek isn't an artist whose work is necessarily rooted in craft, we have this opportunity to think about social engineering, to think about architecture, to think about, you know, how people like Robert Moses really shaped places like New York City through their policies, and how highways and byways really, and railroads bifurcated neighborhoods and created economic opportunities and depressions. And so the show was, yes, inspired by this Green Book, but it was also about having people think about how we move around spaces. And so you can't really see here because I only have a couple of images of the show, but when you enter the gallery space in the museum, you were sort of forced immediately to make decisions about whether you would go left or go right, or whether you would sort of like navigate your way through this roadway that bisected the gallery. It was interesting. We've all been to galleries and museums, of course, which is why I hate showing art to art people. I'm like, why am I showing paintings to people who either make them or deal with this stuff all the time? But, you know, it is what it is, you know? But it was interesting because, you know, you have guards in the gallery in the museum, and they're telling you, you know, you can't get this close. You know, there's a line there. You can't do these things. You know, you have these, like, spatial limitations. But we wanted to challenge that, so we created a sculpture that actually made it impossible for the guards to stop you from getting really close to the work. Because in order to see the show, you had to actually walk through the work. You had to almost touch or brush up against the work to navigate through the space. And so it created a logistical nightmare for them, but it was like a great opportunity for me as the curator and Derek as the artist to see how people would engage with work that was sort of being shown in a sort of unusual way. So the exhibition opened in January. It closed in August. And I will say this before I get to the final part of my talk, is that when this exhibition closed in August, it was the first time in 5 years that I didn't have an exhibition on view somewhere. Like, like the first day in 5 years, because I'd been like working feverishly on various projects and with different artists. And I knew that day was coming, and it was planned because I was making some space for myself to move on to another phase of my journey, my curatorial and art world journey. And you guys are gonna get a little bit of taste of that. I'm gonna talk about it and show you one thing, like not a bunch of it, before the world knows next week. So there's one more Derek Adams slide. I'll kind of get to that, and then maybe I'll just skip ahead and like, what's next? So I know it's kind of so dramatic. I'm so like direct, like, hello, what's next? That's the advertising person in me, right? But wait, there's more. As I mentioned, my passion is really about artists more than it is about art. And I don't know if that's like a really like popular thing to say, but I'm really interested in artists, you know? And sometimes I don't even need to like the art to really get engaged with the artist, because I know that my taste is just subjective. It's like, you know, if God forbid my taste was like dominating the world, you know, I recognize the limitations of my own taste. But what I'm really interested in is the fact that, at least I believe it's a fact, that artists make the world a better place. They transform the world in a positive way. I believe that without any sort of like qualification or equivocation. There's no but. I believe it fully. And I think that it's important that there are people, not just me, but people out there who are thinking about how this world interacts with artists, not just how artists interact with the world. And it's unfortunate that I think a lot of the support, both financial support, fiscal support, structural support, that I perceive to be there in my lifetime seems in some ways to be eroding in certain spaces for artists, yet there's still a tremendous amount of people who are pursuing degrees in art, careers in art, and I'm interested in figuring out how I can be a positive force in sort of like rebuttressing some of that. And so about a year ago, I started thinking about how to put that framework into place. And so a very good friend of mine named Heather Bendari Darcy, Heather used to be a director at Mixed Screens Gallery for 15 years. She worked at Sonnabend, she worked at Lehman Maupin. She co-wrote a book called Artwork, which is a professional development guide for artists that was published originally in 2009 by Simon & Schuster. Before I met Heather in 2013. Before I met Heather, I sat on the edge of my bed in 2010 and I read her book, and I said to myself, this woman gets it. These people are saying exactly what people need to know. This is the information. And then 3 years later, I met Heather. I curated an exhibition at Mixed Screens Gallery. We became friends. Fast forward to last year. They were going to do another edition of the book. I ended up being interviewed for the second edition of the book. So I go from admiring this book to being on 12 pages of the book, which is like, you know, seeing your life go like full circle. So Heather and I were talking, and I said, you know, I want to launch a business that's focused on professional development for artists and arts professionals. I know that there are nonprofits that are working in that space, Creative Capital, many others who've been invested in that for many years. But a lot of those opportunities for artists have been really limited because, for example, I've been a reader for Creative Capital grants for a number of years, at least, you know, over the course of the past 3 or 4 years. I've done it a few times. And they get 5,000 applications and they pick 50 people. And that's not to single out Creative Capital, because there are many other examples of this where you have this like large pool of people, but because of like funding and bandwidth, you can only really work with that's 1%, like 50 out of 5,000 is 1%. So, but this is valuable information. So I have spent all of this year and all of my money preparing to launch a conference for visual artists. There will be an annual conference that will take place in New York City every spring and a second city every fall. The conference is called Art World Conference. The first one will take place in April of 2019 at New York Law School. We are anticipating 300 attendees. That's our goal. We have solidified 30 presenters, what I consider to be sort of like this all-star group of art thinkers who are invested in helping artists advance their careers. People like Dina Haggag from United States Artists, she's our keynote speaker. Folks like Yona Becker, who used to run Third Streaming, who now is at SVA doing some tremendous work. People like Amy Whitaker, who works at NYU and who's written a number of books around like blockchain and other really important aspects of artists developing their careers. Even artists like Brendan Fernandez, who is in Chicago now, originally from Canada, but he's teaching at Northwestern and also really invested in helping artists in that way as well. And so this conference is my sort of like next chapter in the final part of the talk today. It's an opportunity for me to kind of go back, as they say, go back to the beginning, to think about what was the thing that inspired me to get involved in the art world in the beginning, and think about all of the lessons that I've learned and all of the great people that I've met over the past decade, and to galvanize them and to create a framework where people can come together and share best practices around topics such as financial literacy, but that's like a broad thing, financial literacy. What does it mean? To distill it down to how do you buy a home off of an artist's spotty income? How do you manage your debt? How do you get health insurance if you don't work a regular 9 to 5 and you're an artist? How do you deal with visa and immigration issues if you want to continue to travel around the world pursuing your field? How do you collaborate with corporations if you want to do a commissioned project? And so we're bringing people in to deal with all of those kinds of subjects and more. How do you continue to be a functioning artist after getting married and having children? It's questions people have asked me flat out. So this is where it's at. This is my passion. I'm so happy that you guys are here today. And as I said, now you can ask me anything. That's my end of my story. Thank you. So ask me anything.
Now we see. You don't have any
Sure.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask about the last event. So what's the economy around this event? So how
Sure.
do people participate?
Absolutely. So, absolutely. So next week, the website will be live by Tuesday. There will be a press release and announcement, and hopefully people will care about this as much as we do. But the conference is set up in such a way where anyone can register to the conference if they identify themselves as an artist or an arts professional. We've spent a lot of time researching our pricing around the conference. I mean, most business conferences are pretty expensive, so we wanted to make sure that this was not prohibitively expensive. So we've tiered our pricing from $200 to $500 for the entire conference, which is really, really inexpensive and doesn't even create a break-even opportunity around ticketing or registration, but we wanted to make sure that people could attend, because we know that a $1,200 or $2,000 entry for a 3-day conference, it's just prohibitive for so many people. Why even bother? Why go there, so to speak, if you really want to make it accessible? So it's just purely like registration. If you identify as a student, you pay $200. We're not about to go get people's birth certificates and IDs like you're a student, fine, I'll believe it. If you're an artist, you pay $300, I believe it. If you're an arts professional and you feel like you have the bandwidth and you want to pay $500, I'll believe that too. But you'll also be helping support the entry of someone who maybe can't afford to pay the full amount to come in. The first day of the conference will be panels around some of the topics that I mentioned. And then the second day will be 16 workshops. We have 4 tracks. So basically the reason why we're doing it at New York Law School, there's no affiliation to New York Law School. It just happens to be the venue. They have a great auditorium that can hold 300 people. And they have great classrooms that can hold 60 to 75 people. So we have 4 classrooms that will be running workshops around some of these different topics throughout the second day. So you can just pick and choose where you want to be at each time of the day, as long as it's not at capacity. And then we'll do follow-ups with people. Look, I know that no 3-day event is going to change everything about someone's life. But I also know that one or two really important pieces of information can change everything about how you function, you know? And so thinking about how crippling debt can be to people, how paralyzing it can be, to give people an opportunity to be in a room with people who have like dealt with it and have managed it and also have some solutions around it, that can be so liberating. Because I've seen how that can paralyze someone from being creative and doing other things in their life. And so little things like that make a difference. You know, and I think because of the way the world is changing so rapidly, so many artists who are not necessarily like, say, American citizens are trying to figure out like the comings and goings around like, you know, getting their O1 visas and other things. And, you know, and this administration is really trying to make it more and more difficult for people to get O1 visas, right? Just because. I think it's just like spiteful, but that's what's happening. So these are really pertinent issues around health insurance and other issues like that. And this is not a conference that's rooted in, you know, like the things that, we're not talking about auction houses and galleries. I mean, that'll come up because it's just built into the conversation, but we're really focused on the other things, the things that the galleries don't necessarily want to talk about. It was interesting, I found out from Heather when she was interviewing people for her book, there were a number of galleries that did not want to talk to her because they said, we don't want artists to even know this information. We prefer that they don't know. You know, it's sort of like, yeah, it's like, it's better. It's like the power dynamic needs to stay this way because it's more helpful and advantageous for us from a representation standpoint to not have the artist be empowered. So that's, you know, that's the focus. Yeah, yeah. Ask me anything.
So I'm you know, curious about the back end of this. Do you have partners? Have you received grants? How are you going to pull it off?
It is a new, it's a new model. It's a great question. So the company is not a nonprofit, and that was very intentional. So it's a New York State LLC. The reason is, having worked at a number of nonprofits, I know where like sort of like the limitations are in terms of the speed at which I needed to bring this thing to bear. And if I was working on it from a purely nonprofit model, I think my timeline would have had to been much longer than it was. To put that into perspective, we've gotten some great sponsors. You know, Kickstarter is a sponsor. Actually, Morgan Stanley has decided to sponsor. And you know, a couple of others, conversations are happening with others. But these are not, the money that they're giving to sponsor is not enough money to underwrite the endeavor. Right? It is really sort of something that I am, as an entrepreneur, of really investing. I'm investing a lot of my own money and time into making this happen. But the other side of it is the New York Foundation on the Arts, NYFA, New York Foundation for the Arts, they've become our fiscal sponsor. They believe that this conference is so aligned with their focus and their ethos around helping artists that even though we're not a nonprofit, they've decided to be our fiscal sponsor, which allows us to receive donations from foundations and individuals who maybe they're motivated by their tax write-off. I don't know. You know, that's outside of my my realm of knowledge. But what I wanted to say in bringing that up is, for example, there are foundations that want to support the conference, but we started talking to them in the past few months, and they're like, yeah, we'll support you in like 2020 or 2021. So the timelines just really wouldn't really work in terms of how quickly we wanted to do this if we did it as a pure nonprofit. And also, this is the beginning of something else. It's sort of the conference is a product of the company. I don't look at the conference as being the company itself. Yeah.
No, I actually haven't completely finished what I was going to ask you.
No, that's fine. Sure.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you feel that this enterprise you're undertaking comes at the expense of your curatorial practice, or how do you negotiate the two? Do you see yourself still working in the gallery and with objects, or is it really more about the people and the artists?
Well, I like to think that I'm going to like slow down, but my threshold for pain and somehow my sort of like desire for no sleep and suffering seems to be without end. So I know I'm going to end up doing more curatorial work regardless. For example, I have a show opening in May called Coffee, Rum, Sugar, and Gold, a Post-Colonial Paradox. It's going to be at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. I'm collaborating with a good friend of mine named Larry Osei-Mensah. This is our 4th project together. So I'm continuing to do curatorial work. I think that that really will continue to feed my sort of like passion and creativity. So I'm not foregoing it completely, but I needed to think about, I needed to think more long term. Sort of, there's nothing stopping me from just like curating show after show, year after year for the next 35 years of my life. Like I could do that and that would be great and I would enjoy it. But I wanted to figure out how I could get back to the sort of like the core driving rationale that got me involved in this to begin with and how I could really propel that. Yeah. Is that it? It's fine if it is. Well, I'll end with saying, I'm very happy to have been invited out here. I want to thank LAXART. I want to thank Artadia. I think that any opportunity for people to come together and have a meaningful conversation is really important. It goes without saying that in this day and age, civilized conversation that's both fair and measured and balanced is really needed. You know? Sure, absolutely. Oh, it's not too late. It's never too late.
Since it's a 3-day workshop, right?
A 3-day event, yes.
3-day event. So, will there be some sort of a professional help from the workshop for people who would want to apply for grants? That there would be some kind of a help for people who haven't been successful at, say, getting grants, have tried getting grants. Are there going to be such platforms for people?
Yes, well, within the framework of the conference, there will be grant workshops, there will be grant writing and residency writing workshops, and more along, less of the creative aspect of that, and more along the lines of the logistic and tactical aspect of that, because everybody has their own story and everyone has to kind of figure out a way to tell that story, and it would be too much getting into the weeds, I think, to try to tease out the individual stories, but it's more about like what works and what doesn't work. And if you have an application due in 2 weeks and you haven't even started it, okay, here's what you need to do in order to get it done. Those kinds of things that I think a lot of people find themselves like up against it. And so it's really more of that. But I think the spirit of what you're asking might be maybe a bit more, maybe slightly different. And that is whether there'll be continued sort of like follow-up opportunities for people, because there's a limit to what you can kind of do in a couple of days. And the answer is yes. And as I was mentioning, the conference is a product of the company. So the company will ultimately become more of a place, both physical and virtual, more of a place for this information to be available to people on demand, but also in a very sort of intimate and personal way, which is very difficult to do, but I'm up for the challenge. You know, I figure, I'm not trying to get to Mars, right? If Elon Musk is trying to get to Mars, then I can do this. He'll do that, I'll do this. And we'll just see who gets there first. Okay, that's it. Well, thank you guys. Thanks.